So I've always liked when other YouTubers, do a quick bookshelf tour. My bookshelf kind of grew based on the inspiration of seeing other people's. I think what I have at no other bookshelf. Welcome back to the Muscle Code YouTube channel. This is part 3 of the top 5 fantasy series, in my opinion, based on what I've read. And before I get into number 1, which is a little anticlimactic anyway, let me just touch on real briefly 3 series that I see show up in other people's top 5, top 10 lists, just to kind of, nip in the bud any, complaints that people might have in the comments or whatever. So Lord of the Rings is obviously, it basically started the whole fantasy genre. I've never actually read it all the way through. I've tried multiple times. I just can't get into it. I've tried. I've honestly tried. I've given it the effort. I can only do what I can do. I have promised myself I'll read it when I turn 40. It's just something that I joked about, and now it's become kind of like a thing I'm definitely going to do. So that is not in my top 5. Wheel of Time, I finished that entire series, all 14 books. Books 1 through 5 of Wheel of Time were really good. I've read them twice. I love them. And there was just too much of a drop in the middle of that series where the books just weren't strong. I mean, it was several pages just to describe what all the women were wearing in a couple scenes. It's just, it didn't, and I put, because I read Wheel of Time and The Dark Tower, I think in the same year, and I was curious to see which I would like better. And The Dark Tower ended with a little bit more of a twist, and that brought it all together, where Wheel of Time, in my opinion, didn't end. It's a funny thing, one person wrote, all right, now we finished Wheel of Times, let's theorize better endings. And I couldn't agree with her that more, where it's like the ending didn't have enough of a twist to make it worth reading 14 big ass fantasy books to get there. So that's why Wheel of Time isn't in the top 5. And then Malazan, Book of the Fallen, I've tried to read it, and I know people say stick with it. It becomes like the most amazing book experience you've ever had. But I'm taking it off my my reading list just because I've tried to read it. It's reading the first book, Gardens of the Moon, is like putting sand through a shaker. It's just you read it and the sand goes through and nothing stays. I've read the first half of that book. Can't tell you anything about it. It's so strange. But I've come to the conclusion it's too much high fantasy, too much like sorcery, and it's just too over the top. So I've officially taken it off my reading list. So that's why Malazan doesn't show up into my top 5 either. So to get to the winner, no doubt about it, hands down, A Song of Ice and Fire, my number 1 fantasy series in my top 5 list of best fantasy series. I wouldn't be here today talking about books. I wouldn't have any of this without Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire. And what makes it number 1, in my opinion, is the world, like the world building, Westeros, how everything goes together. That's what makes it amazing. The detail into the history of the families, into the history of the geography, how everything works together is awesome. And it's interesting. I have what you put up in your wall is a big indication of what you love, what's important to you. Growing up, I had Syracuse basketball posters on my wall. I had Zelda posters. And I have a big Game of Thrones, really cool Game of Thrones map. A map of Westeros hung up in my wall. In my office. That's the only thing in my office is a kind of like a vintage Game of Thrones Westeros map. So that's the map of the world. I don't have pictures of Jon. I don't have pictures of Tyrion. I don't have pictures of the cool moments that happen in the story. I have a picture of the map that represents the world. So that's what separates it. I mean, the detail, you really feel like when you're reading these books, you really feel like you're in Westeros. Like the detail, the history of the things, it all works together. I mean, there's a river that goes through the middle of Westeros called the Mander, and the Manderleys, who are dispossessed now live in the north. They used to rule down there, so that's why it's called the Mander. It's just all works together. Some other fantasy series, the names of rivers or the names of cities, it's arbitrary. And especially Wheel of Time, it's arbitrary. Where Game of Thrones, it makes total sense. The history is it feels organic. It feels organic. So it's the more I've read other series, the more I've liked some other writers, and I've kind of uncovered some of George R.R. Martin's flaws. The more advanced I've become at reading, writing, and some other authors I like more than him right now in terms of enjoyability, and some of it's a little detailed dense when you pick it apart, and maybe the story got out of hand with A Dance with Dragons. It's a little too many loose threads, but throw all that out the window. I would do anything for Winds of Winter to come out, book 6, so you can throw all the complaints, all the criticisms out the window. Because if Winds of Winter came out, I'd stop everything up. I would do anything for Winds of Winter book 6, and a lot of readers would feel the same way. So throw all the criticisms out the window, throw all my new preferences out and tastes out the window. Everyone's still waiting for that book and excited for that book to come out. So Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire is my number 1 in my top 5 list. Maybe in the future I'll rank the top 5 A Song of Ice and Fire books from 5 to 1. That might be a good. I could do like two. Maybe I'll do like a live stream or like a 2-hour video on that. But thanks for watching this list. I look forward to my next few, and thanks for stopping by. So I've always liked when other YouTubers, do a quick bookshelf tour. My bookshelf kind of grew based on the inspiration of seeing other people's. I think what